Section 2 of the test, which is the half-hour section that isn't done by history and economics candidates but is by all the others who take the TSA, has 4 essay titles. You choose one of them and you answer it. Just one, and it doesn't have to be one that has any special relationship to the degree that you've chosen to apply for. You have a completely free choice of any of the 4 that meet you. If you think you can write a good essay on it, then if you're a psychology applicant and the one that you choose to answer doesn't have a very strong science component, that's absolutely fine. There's no requirement on anyone to answer any particular one of the essay titles. We set the titles because we think they'll be interesting to applicants across the broad range of degrees for those who take the test, and we set them without any expectation that particular detailed knowledge from A-level or from reading newspapers or from any other source will make a big difference to how anybody can do on the questions. The questions are there to ask you to argue and reason. So here's 4 questions that were the set of questions set on one of the TSA papers that was used last year. So many people across the globe sit this test that we actually have multiple versions of the test every year, and we set on each of them 4 different essay questions. This is the one that was taken by most candidates last year. So there are 4 questions here which you can have a look at and think which one you would want to do. We want you to answer the question on the page. We don't want you to think of the question as being a headline for another question that we haven't actually asked but is the one that we really meant. The question here is the question we want you to answer. Of course, if you had more than half an hour, you'd be able to say a lot. You'd be able to say a great deal about any of these questions, but you do only have half an hour, so you need to think about what the most important things are in answering the question. Now, one of the big differences this year is going to be the use of computers. And we've experienced this already in our final examinations last academic year. And so we want to say a few things about how to sit tests on computers. Some of you will perhaps be quite used to doing this, but most may well not be. Writing at a computer, there will be a word limit. The word limit here is intended absolutely seriously. It means both that you mustn't write more than that, but it also means that you shouldn't aim at it. A limit is not a target. A target is something to aim at, and we don't have a word target. But we certainly don't want you to be aiming at the word limit. We don't want you to do that because if you do, you probably won't get to do the right kinds of things in the test. The 2 things that you need to do, and you do them if you were handwriting and you will have to do them when you're typing as well, are thinking, planning and writing. And the 3 tasks, thinking, planning and writing, if you do those well, are likely to mean that you're a long way short of any word limit that we might set. You're certainly not going to achieve 750 or 800 words in the course of doing this thinking and planning and writing, because the thinking and planning will take time. I went back over a few past papers that I had to hand from previous years and looked at the essays to see which of the essays which had scored really good marks, marks of 70 and above was what I set as a target, what their word count was. They varied, but they varied between about 450 and 550 words. 550 was about the limit at the top end of what the best essays produced. They could have been longer. There was a little bit of space on some of them to write more words, but 550 words was a long, good essay, and 450 was a short, good essay. But I don't think the people who wrote those essays were thinking in terms of their word counts at all. They were just thinking about answering the question and doing it well. And I think that's a good guide for all applicants. If you're performing the task correctly, the question of word limits will not even become relevant to you. So let's think about what a question might look like and how we might approach it. So here's one, the first one, the one that was actually done by more candidates, I think, than any other last year on the TSA. Should children strike to demand action on a major issue such as climate change? So quite a topical question last year, and it was one that raises the important question when you're thinking about the question, what is it about? Well, lots of answers spent a long time talking about climate change, about what climate change is, what its effects might be, about why climate change matters. And if the question had been, why does climate change matter, then it would have been the case that people who did that would have written perfectly good essays. But this isn't a title that's about climate change. It does mention climate change, but it does so as an example of a major issue. And the most popular name, in fact possibly the only name of anybody who was mentioned in this essay at all, was that of Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg was mentioned by perhaps as many as half of the candidates, and she seems a perfectly reasonable person to mention, even if, as one candidate did, they called her Greenberg. Sorry, Greta. But a major issue such as climate change. We might want to think, if we had enough time, what counts as a major issue. Climate change surely is a major issue, but how do we measure what's to count as a major issue, or how do we know how climate change ranks among major issues? So here's a list of things that people have got upset about in my hearing in recent months. Pineapple on pizza, plastic pollution in rivers and oceans, socks worn with sandals, Black Lives Matter movement, modern slavery, and uncovered wickets in first-class cricket. That last one's a little bit obscure, but those of you who know anything about cricket will know that people can get very upset one way or the other about that. Well, those are all issues, and we could have a discussion about which ones of them are major issues. I suspect we probably wouldn't have too much difficulty in agreeing on which they were. But the core of the question isn't even about that, although we are getting closer to the question if we're thinking about that. The core of the question is about striking children, children who strike to demand action about something. So what would it be to think about that? Well, one thing we might do is to think about what it is to go on strike. School strikes don't seem to be quite the same thing as industrial action, as people who work in a factory or in a shop refusing to go to work. So are these the same things? Well, we might say that there are ways in which they are the same, but also ways in which they aren't. In some ways, yes. Those who strike, they forego a benefit, and they do so in order to bring about some change, usually in the organisation they're striking against. The children forego the benefit of education, and we might say that's a bit like foregoing one's wages. But disrupting a school by not turning up doesn't seem quite like disrupting a business. It doesn't quite seem the same kind of thing. So we might say in some ways it's the same, and in some ways it's different. We might also ask, when we're thinking about what we're going to do with the question, and this might seem to us the most important thing, it's about children. If adults have a right to strike, and not all adults in all occupations may have a right to strike, but if adults sometimes have a right to strike. Is it an important thing to distinguish between adults and children? Well, here are a few of the very good things that people thought about when they were thinking about it being children. Children might be manipulated, so of course might adults, but children might be more prone to being manipulated by adults in order to bring about some outcome. Children might be expected at least to be slightly more ignorant of the issues than adults might be. There are issues of safety that might affect children disproportionately compared to adults. And we might also think that the loss of education which children suffer is such a major thing that we think that it's really not acceptable for children to be going on strike. A number of people who did think about loss of education said that there was an irony that the children who were going on strike about climate change might otherwise be in biology lessons learning about climate change and be able to do more about it than striking would actually do to improve the situation. So we might try to focus our minds by just thinking of some alternatives. So does it seem importantly different to us if the child striking was a 15-year-old biology GCSE student who's maybe watched every Chris Packham or David Attenborough documentary that's going? They've been a member of environmental organisations since they were 8, and they're protesting about something they know perfectly well about, something like plastic pollution. On the other hand, maybe a 5-year-old protests that his mother says that a 9 o'clock bedtime is to be imposed upon him, and so he goes on strike, doesn't go to school because of his 9 o'clock bedtime regime. Well, you might think there's important differences between those, and that the 15-year-old you could make a better case for than the 5-year-old. You might think even with the 15-year-old you couldn't make a good enough case, but you might think you could, and many who argued in the essay said you could, and some said you couldn't. But the 5-year-old is a little bit more difficult to justify. So let's reverse those cases and let's ask whether a 15-year-old biology GCSE student protesting about his mother's imposition of an 11 o'clock bedtime is going to be justified in not going to school, going on strike because of an 11 o'clock bedtime. Well, that's an issue for that biology student, but it's probably not a major issue like climate change, and in any event, it's probably not a very sensible thing to be doing. But the 5-year-old wants to protest about plastic pollution. They've heard it matters, they've got some sense that it's an important thing, and they want to strike from school because of plastic pollution. Is it the significance of the issue that makes a difference? Is it the age of the child or the vulnerability of the child that makes a difference? You probably are going to want at this point to engage in a little bit of nuanced thinking about which of these things is actually doing the most work, or, which is something that a lot of candidates who saw this point wanted to do, ask the question, what's a child for the purpose of this essay? Anyway, those thoughts might begin to get you thinking about what you might do with this. What you absolutely shouldn't do with it is to write a page and a half, or type a page and a half, about climate change, because that's not really the core of what the question's about. Striking from school affects other people, but parents striking affects other people as well. So some people who started down a line that said, well, lots of people are affected by strikes, might have thought, oh, yes, but all strikes affect other people as well, and not just those who are being struck against. So if you can actually have the thought, here's a line of argument, and it's one that I'm probably pretty committed to, but here are things that somebody might say back to that, then produce a little bit of counter-argument, and then say what you would say back to the counter-argument, and you're starting to generate a structure of argument in your essay that will help you and help the person who's reading it to get a sense that you've thought about some of the issues. So just to repeat, think, plan, write. Most people who do the essay test as part of the TSA probably don't spend quite enough time thinking and planning. But like the multiple choice bit, you need to think and you need to plan quite quickly because there isn't much time. So again, you're being put under pressure to do these things, but not, absolutely not, to write as much as you can. It's very important that you get the sense that that's not what the task is. If you do, if you enjoy thinking and planning and writing, then that really does bode very well for your success in your university application, perhaps to Oxford, but really at any university you might go to. You'll be somebody who stands out because you're thinking for yourself and wanting to ask questions and wanting to generate good arguments, and that's something that any university would be really pleased and really proud of its students for doing. We hope you'll find the experience of doing the essay, both the one in the test and any essays you might do in preparation for the test, a useful and an enjoyable one. You'll enjoy thinking about the different subjects we've set in the different questions and enjoy arguing about them in your own mind or even with your friends. If you're not used to composing essays on a computer, it may very well be that it's worth giving that a try, but also worth trying them with a pen and paper and seeing how different that experience is so that you can get some of the qualities that may be easier to do through the end of a pen and get those as part of your process of writing at the computer. Experience suggests that people who type essays directly into a computer often concentrate on what it looks like or how long it is rather more than they do on the actual content. And I think that it's very well worth you reflecting for yourself and being a bit self-conscious about what the demands of working on a computer actually are. It's much easier for an examiner to read an essay that's typed on a computer, that's certainly true, but it's not always more enjoyable if the essay itself turns out to be bland or to be asking the wrong things or to be far too long to actually have a focused attention on the subject of the essay question itself. So do prepare for the essay every bit as much as you do for the multiple choice bit. Both of them need preparation and they need thinking about. There's more information about the TSA test on the web address that's at the top of this slide. The one at the bottom is the general web address for Oxford undergraduate admissions. These addresses will give you access to some of the latest information about what's happening in admissions this year. There are a number of changes which we've talked about with the TSA, but there are other changes too, particularly that all interviews this year will be online rather than face-to-face in Oxford, as most of them have been in previous years. So do look at those websites and do try and keep up to date with the changes that will take place inevitably as the situation of the pandemic continues. Thank you for listening to this video. Thank you for thinking of applying to Oxford. Do please enjoy the preparation as much as you can, and for some of you at least, we'll look forward to seeing you eventually at interview, but it'll be through a computer screen. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.